This video looks at how to use the semicolon correctly. The semicolon is this punctuation mark. It looks a bit like a combination of a period and a comma, and it kind of is. It's stronger than a comma, but less final than a period. There are only 3 real ways to use the semicolon correctly. The first is to combine 2 closely related independent clauses which are not already joined by a conjunction. The second is to separate independent clauses that are joined by what's called a conjunctive adverb. And the third is to separate items in a list when commas alone would be confusing. Let's look at each of these a little more closely. The first is joining independent clauses. To review, an independent clause can stand on its own as a complete sentence. You also want to make sure that these clauses are not already joined by a conjunction. And a conjunction is a joining word, could be a coordinating conjunction, which connects independent clauses, and these are your 7 fanboys, for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so, or you may have learned this as and, nor, for, but, so, yet. Subordinating conjunctions connect independent clauses with dependent clauses. Those are words like although, because, even if, and so on. Let's look at an example of 2 closely related independent clauses that we could join with a semicolon. He cannot buy a new phone. He does not have much money. Right now, this is a sentence error. It's called a run-on because we've joined what could stand as 2 complete sentences. He cannot buy a new phone, and he does not have much money, and we've joined them with absolutely nothing. Even a comma would be wrong here, which is a different type of run-on called a comma splice. One way we can fix this is to use a semicolon. Notice the punctuation. There's a capital H at the beginning and then a lowercase h for our second independent clause, because now we've made one sentence. He cannot buy a new phone, semicolon. He does not have much money. The semicolon joins these 2 closely related independent clauses. Each time you do this, follow this format. Capital letter, independent clause, semicolon, lowercase, independent clause, period. The second way to use a semicolon is to separate independent clauses that are joined by what's called a conjunctive adverb. Some examples of conjunctive adverbs are however, one of the most common, therefore, in addition, thus, nevertheless, indeed, still, and then. Here's an example. She likes cats, she prefers dogs. This is another run-on sentence, and it needs fixing. We could join the 2 related sentences with a semicolon. This would be correct, but since she likes cats, she prefers dogs shows contrast, a word like however makes a lot of sense here. So even better would be, she likes cats, however, she prefers dogs. Notice that the punctuation is always semicolon, then the conjunctive adverb, then a comma. So each time you want to follow this format. Capital letter independent clause, semicolon, conjunctive adverb like however, comma, independent clause, period. The third way to use a semicolon correctly is to separate items in a list when commas alone would be confusing. Let's look at an example. They traveled to Paris, France, Lima, Peru, Cairo, Egypt, Seoul, South Korea, and Canberra, Australia. Wait a second, those weren't a bunch of different places. Those were cities and their countries listed separately. The commas alone make it a bit confusing. So instead, we want to separate the units, like Paris, France, from other cities and their countries. If only we had a mega comma. But there's no giant comma you could use. Instead, we use a semicolon. For example, they traveled to Paris, France, semicolon, Lima, Peru, semicolon, Cairo, Egypt, Seoul, South Korea, and Canberra, Australia, period. Notice that those semicolons act like giant commas separating larger units like Paris, France, which needs the comma because grammatically that's how we separate a city and its country. Let's recap. Here are the three ways. Combining two closely related independent clauses can be summarized as sentence, semicolon, sentence. Number 2 is to separate independent clauses that are joined by a conjunctive adverb, like however. So this really looks like sentence, semicolon, however, comma, sentence. And finally, to separate items in a list when commas alone would be confusing, well, that's the semicolon as a mega comma. Now it's your turn. On your worksheet, you have some examples. Number 1, she was successful and well-liked. She won the student election by a landslide. Pause the video and try to correct this using the semicolon. Let's look at the answer. She was successful and well-liked, semicolon. She won the student election by a landslide. She was successful and well-liked could stand on its own as its own sentence, and a related sentence that could stand on its own, she won the student election by a landslide, can be joined to it with a semicolon. Example number 2. I used to find semicolons confusing, now I know how to use them correctly. Pause the video and give this one a try. Let's look at the answer. I used to find semicolons confusing, semicolon. However, comma, now I know how to use them correctly. Make sure you have the semicolon and the comma surrounding your conjunctive adverb like however. Otherwise, the punctuation is not correct. Example number 3. The multiple choice answers are 1, C, 2, A, 3, B, 4, C, and 5, D. Hopefully you can hear that needs some help. Pause the video and give it a try. Here are the answers. You're going to separate 1, C using a semicolon from 2A, semicolon, 3B, semicolon, 4C, semicolon, and 5D. Make sure you end your sentence with a period. And that's the semicolon.